A German shepherd awaiting euthanasia cried in his kennel at the shelter. Then it happened. Rex lay on the cold concrete floor of his kennel, the faint scent of bleach and despair lingering in the air around him. The steady hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Dogs barked endlessly in the surrounding cages, their cries bouncing off the metal bars in a cacophony of desperation. But Rex remained silent. He had long since given up trying to make his presence known. Not too long ago, he would have barked, whimpered, or wagged his tail in an attempt to catch the attention of the humans passing by. Now he barely lifted his head. His dark eyes, once bright and curious, had dulled, reflecting the hopelessness that had settled deep within him. He had learned that no one ever stopped for the quiet dog in the corner. The shelter staff tried to be kind, but their efforts often went unnoticed by Rex. When they placed a fresh bowl of food in his cage, he would nibble at it mechanically. Not because he was hungry, but because his body required it. Occasionally, a soft voice would call his name, but even then, his ears would only flick slightly. Rex no longer trusted humans, and he had every reason not to. The scars that traced his body were reminders of hands that had harmed rather than helped, of shouted commands that turned into angry blows when he failed to obey. Memories of his old life haunted him, fragmented and sharp, like pieces of a broken mirror. He could recall the chain that had tethered him to a splintered wooden post in a barren yard, the sting of a whip across his flank, the hollow ache of an empty stomach. And then, one day, he had been left there, abandoned. The hands that once fed him never returned, and it was almost a relief when a stranger found him and brought him to the shelter. Almost. Across the city, Emily sat curled up on her worn-out couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. The day had been long, as it often was, filled with endless tasks at the veterinary clinic where she worked. She loved her job, but it was emotionally draining in ways most people didn't understand. She saw too many animals come and go, some leaving with loving families, others leaving for reasons that broke her heart. That night, her fingers froze as she scrolled past a picture. The photograph was unremarkable, poorly lit and slightly grainy, but its subject hit her like a punch to the chest. It was a German shepherd, his head lowered, his eyes fixed on the ground. The caption read, "Rex scheduled for euthanasia tomorrow. No inquiries." Emily stared at the image, an unexplainable feeling tugging at her. The look in his eyes wasn't just sadness, it was resignation. As though he had accepted his fate and found no reason to fight it. She knew that look too well. It was the same one she saw in the mirror after her father left, when the weight of abandonment had settled into her bones. She clicked on the post, her heartbeat quickening. It wasn't the first time she had thought about adopting a dog. She had often imagined giving one of the shelter animals a second chance, but life always seemed to get in the way. Her apartment was small, her budget tight, and her confidence in her ability to handle a dog, especially one with a troubled past, was shaky at best. Still, the image of Rex lingered in her mind, even as she closed her phone and tried to distract herself with a book. But the words blurred together, and the pages refused to hold her attention. By the time she climbed into bed, the decision had already begun to form in the back of her mind, though she wasn't ready to admit it to herself. The next morning, Emily woke with a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. She dressed quickly, throwing on a loose sweater and jeans, and grabbed her keys. The shelter wasn't far, but the drive felt endless. Her palms were clammy as she gripped the steering wheel, her thoughts swirling in chaotic loops. What if she was too late? What if Rex had already been euthanized? She pushed the thought away, focusing on the road. When she arrived, the sound of barking and the metallic tang of disinfectant greeted her. A staff member approached, her expression wary but polite. "I'm here for Rex," Emily blurted, before she could lose her nerve. The woman's face softened slightly, though her eyes held a trace of surprise. "He's scheduled for today," she said, "but if you're serious, we can hold off." Emily was led down a narrow hallway lined with cages, the noise growing louder with each step. When they stopped in front of Rex's kennel, her breath caught in her throat. He looked even more defeated in person. His body curled tightly as if trying to make himself invisible. At the sound of the door opening, he lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, Emily felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. His eyes, dark and tired, seemed to hold a question. "Why are you here?" She knelt down slowly, careful not to startle him. "Hi, Rex," she said softly, her voice trembling. He didn't move, but his ears flicked toward her. She extended her hand through the bars, palm up, offering nothing but the scent of her presence. For a moment, he didn't respond, and she wondered if she had made a mistake. But then, almost imperceptibly, his nose twitched. He leaned forward just enough to sniff her fingers before retreating again. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Emily to know she couldn't walk away. The adoption process was a blur, paperwork and questions blending together as Emily answered everything with determination. By the time she walked out of the shelter with Rex on a leash, the weight of her decision began to sink in. He walked beside her reluctantly, his steps slow and hesitant. The car ride home was silent, except for the occasional sound of Rex shifting in the back seat. Emily glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her heart aching at how small and lost he looked. When they arrived at her apartment, she opened the door and let him inside, giving him space to explore. He didn't move far from the entrance, his body tense and his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Emily sat down on the floor a few feet away, not wanting to overwhelm him. "This is your home now," she said softly. Rex didn't respond, but his ears twitched at the sound of her voice. She stayed there, quiet and patient, until he finally settled down, curling up near the door. The silence between them was heavy but not hopeless. It was the silence of two beings learning to trust, one small step at a time. As the evening stretched on, Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Rex's journey was just beginning, and so was hers. The first days with Rex were harder than Emily had anticipated. She had read countless articles about rescuing dogs with traumatic pasts, but none of them prepared her for the silent walls Rex had built around himself. He spent most of his time curled in the corner near the door, as if unwilling to commit to being part of the space she had prepared for him. The plush bed she bought sat untouched, and the toys she scattered nearby remained ignored. He refused to eat from his bowl unless she left the room, and even then, it was only when hunger forced his hand, or rather, his paw. Each morning, Emily woke early to sit on the floor a few feet away from him, holding her coffee and speaking softly about nothing in particular. She told him about her work, the quirky clients at the vet clinic, and the stray cat who had taken to napping on the clinic's front steps. Her words floated through the air like gentle offerings, met only by the occasional flicker of Rex's ears. But she didn't mind the silence. She understood it. Emily knew what it was like to exist behind invisible walls. Her childhood had taught her how to protect herself with distance, how to keep people at bay to avoid getting hurt. After her father had walked out when she was 9, leaving nothing behind but an empty chair at the dinner table, Emily had become an expert at hiding her emotions. Even now, as an adult, the edges of that old wound sometimes throbbed when she let herself get too close to people. Maybe that was why she felt such an unexplainable pull toward Rex. She saw her own guarded heart reflected in his wary eyes, and so she gave him space, even when every instinct urged her to rush forward and shower him with affection. On the 4th night, a breakthrough came in the smallest of gestures. Emily was sitting on the couch, reading a worn paperback, when she heard the soft click of claws against the hardwood floor. She held her breath, lowering the book slowly, and turned her head just enough to see Rex standing a few feet away. His posture was cautious, his head low, but his gaze was fixed on her. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in a fragile bubble of trust. Then, as if deciding to test the waters, Rex took a single step forward. Emily didn't reach out or make a sound. She simply stayed still, letting him close the distance at his own pace. When he finally stopped beside her, she allowed her hand to drop gently to her side, fingers brushing the floor. Rex sniffed her hand tentatively, his warm breath tickling her skin.
It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The next morning, Emily woke to find Rex standing by the back door, his tail hanging low but not tucked under his body. She took it as a sign and grabbed the leash, clipping it onto his collar with slow, deliberate movements. "Let's try a walk," she murmured, her voice steady but soft. Outside, the crisp morning air greeted them, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and distant with smoke. Rex walked close to her side, his movements stiff and hesitant. Every loud noise, a passing car, the sudden bark of a dog from a nearby yard, made him flinch, his body jerking toward her as if seeking reassurance. Emily kept her pace slow, speaking to him in soothing tones whenever he seemed unsure. By the time they returned home, his steps were slightly more relaxed, and she felt a glimmer of hope that the outside world might not always seem so threatening to him. Later that day, Emily's neighbor, Walter, leaned over the fence as she stood in the yard with Rex. Walter was a retired schoolteacher with a kind face and a slow, deliberate way of speaking that made everything he said sound wise. "That's a fine dog you've got there," he said, nodding toward Rex. Emily smiled faintly, glancing at the German Shepherd, who was watching Walter with cautious curiosity. "Thanks," she replied. "He's a work in progress." Walter chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Aren't we all? Dogs like him, they just need time. Patience and kindness will get you farther than you think." Emily nodded, her fingers tightening slightly on the leash. She appreciated Walter's words, even if they didn't feel entirely true in the moment. Patience was easy to preach but harder to practice when each day felt like a slow crawl forward. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Emily noticed Rex lingering closer to the kitchen than usual. She set aside a small piece of chicken from her plate, crouching down and holding it out to him. He hesitated, his body tense, but after a few moments, he inched forward and took the offering from her hand. The touch of his teeth against her fingers was feather-like, almost apologetic, as if he feared she might snatch it away. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It was such a simple thing, accepting food directly from her hand, but it felt like a crack in the armor he had built around himself. The days that followed were a series of small steps, each one building on the last. Rex began to follow Emily from room to room, his presence a quiet shadow in the background. He still avoided the plush bed she had bought for him, but she often caught him watching her as she moved around the apartment, his dark eyes filled with a curiosity that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, she sat cross-legged on the floor with a box of old photos spread out around her. She told Rex about her mother, about the summers they used to spend at the lake before everything changed. Her voice faltered when she mentioned her father, but she kept talking, her words spilling into the quiet room like a confession. Rex lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, and for the first time, Emily felt like he was truly listening. Not every moment was a victory. There were setbacks, like the time she tried to coax him onto the couch beside her and he froze, his body rigid with fear, or the time she accidentally dropped a metal bowl in the kitchen and he bolted to the far corner of the apartment, trembling. Each time, Emily reminded herself that healing wasn't a straight path. She celebrated the victories, no matter how small, and treated the setbacks as opportunities to learn more about the dog she was beginning to see as a companion rather than a project. One night, as she lay in bed with the soft hum of rain against the windows, she felt a weight shift at the foot of the mattress. She didn't open her eyes, not wanting to scare him away, but she knew it was Rex. His presence was tentative, as if he wasn't entirely sure he belonged there. But he stayed, and Emily fell asleep with a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since bringing Rex home, she began to believe they could both find peace. Not just as individuals, but together. Emily woke to the soft weight of Rex's head resting on her feet, his presence warm and grounding. It was the first time he had willingly joined her on the bed, and though she kept her movements gentle, her heart swelled with quiet triumph. This moment was another small victory, a fragile thread of trust that had taken weeks to weave. As she slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him. Rex stirred but didn't retreat. Instead, he watched her with those deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to study her every move. It was a gaze that held questions, as though he was beginning to wonder if her kindness was something he could rely on. Emily smiled at him softly before heading to the kitchen, where the rhythmic clatter of coffee preparation filled the quiet morning. The smell of fresh coffee soon mingled with the subtle scent of rain lingering from the storm overnight. She poured herself a mug and returned to the living room, where Rex now sat by the window, his posture alert but not tense. Outside, the world was damp and glistening, the sun breaking through the clouds in weak rays. She sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, sipping her coffee in silence as Rex continued to observe the world beyond the glass. Over the next few days, Rex's progress began to accelerate in small but noticeable ways. He followed her more closely now, his steps no longer hesitant but deliberate, as though he wanted to be near her. His appetite improved, and he started to show interest in the toys she had left scattered around the apartment, nosing at a plush bone one afternoon before tentatively gnawing on its edge. Emily praised him softly, her voice carrying genuine warmth, and Rex's tail twitched in what might have been the beginning of a wag. Despite the progress, there were moments of regression that reminded her of the fragility of their bond. One evening, as Emily prepared dinner, a loud knock at the door startled them both. Rex bolted to the corner of the room, his body trembling, and Emily cursed under her breath at the unexpected visitor. It turned out to be her neighbor Walter, dropping off a bag of fresh produce from his garden. Walter apologized for the interruption, his kind eyes flicking toward the quivering dog in the corner. "He's still learning to trust," Emily explained with a rueful smile, accepting the bag. Walter nodded thoughtfully. "He'll get there," he said. "Just keep showing him that the world isn't always a scary place." The next day, Emily decided to take Walter's words to heart. She clipped Rex's leash onto his collar and led him outside for a longer walk than usual, guiding him toward a small park a few blocks away. The park was quiet, with only a few early risers out walking their dogs or jogging along the paths. Rex stayed close to her side, his ears flicking nervously at every sound, but he didn't pull or resist. Emily brought a small bag of treats, rewarding him each time he managed to stay calm despite the distractions around them. As they rounded a bend in the path, a golden retriever bounded toward them, its owner calling out a cheerful greeting. Rex froze, his body stiffening, and Emily immediately crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Rex," she murmured, her voice steady. The golden retriever slowed its approach, sensing Rex's unease, and Emily offered the other owner a grateful smile as they passed without incident. Rex relaxed slightly, his tail lowering from its rigid position, and Emily gave him a treat with a quiet, "Good boy." It wasn't a perfect encounter, but it was progress, and that was enough. That evening, as they settled back into the apartment, Emily found herself scrolling through old adoption papers she had received from the shelter. Most of the information was vague, but one detail caught her attention: a note about Rex's previous owner being flagged for neglect. The thought made her stomach churn, anger and sadness intertwining as she wondered what horrors Rex had endured before ending up at the shelter. She noticed a small scar on his flank, something she hadn't paid much attention to before, and her mind began to piece together fragments of his past. She reached out to Walter the next day, asking if he knew anything about the process of tracing a dog's history. Walter listened carefully, nodding as she explained her concerns. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep," he said gently. "Focus on the life you're building for him now." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that understanding Rex's past might help her navigate his future. A few weeks later, that lingering curiosity led her to a troubling discovery. While sorting through a box of old papers she had brought home from the shelter, she found a faded photo tucked between the pages. The image showed Rex as a younger dog, standing beside a man with a harsh expression and a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man's grip on Rex's leash was tight, almost possessive, and the background of the photo revealed a grim-looking yard surrounded by a rusting chain-link fence. Emily's breath caught as she studied the image, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? And what role had he played in Rex's life? The scar on Rex's side suddenly seemed heavier, a tangible reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. The following week, Emily's fears were realized when a stranger appeared at her door. He was tall and unkempt, with a cigarette tucked behind his ear and a cold glint in his eyes. "That's my dog," he said bluntly, pointing toward Rex, who had retreated to the far corner of the room. Emily's heart raced, her instincts screaming to protect Rex. "He's not yours anymore," she said firmly, standing her ground. The man's sneer deepened. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning and walking away. Emily locked the door behind him, her hands trembling as she sank to the floor beside Rex. She wrapped her arms around him, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let anyone take him away, not after everything they had been through. The encounter left Emily shaken but determined. She contacted the shelter, the local police, and even a lawyer, ensuring that Rex's adoption was legally binding and that his former owner had no claim to him. She began to consider more drastic measures, wondering if they might need to leave the city to escape the shadows of Rex's past. Meanwhile, Rex seemed to sense her heightened anxiety, staying closer to her side than ever before. One night, as she sat journaling about their progress, Rex placed his head in her lap for the first time. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply trusting, that Emily felt tears prick at her eyes. She stroked his fur gently, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. "I'll protect you, Rex," she said, "no matter what." In that moment, she knew their bond had become unbreakable. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The decision to leave the city came swiftly after that fateful encounter. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her, a creeping unease that made her glance over her shoulder even during the simplest tasks. Rex had begun to mirror her anxiety, his ears perking at every sound, his body tense as though anticipating danger. It wasn't fair to him or to either of them to live like this. They needed a place where shadows couldn't follow, where the past would lose its grip. With Walter's help, Emily found a small cabin nestled in the countryside, far removed from the city's noise and chaos. The property was modest but perfect, a single-story home surrounded by sprawling fields and bordered by dense woods. It had a fenced yard for Rex to explore and endless trails where they could walk in peace. The day they moved, Emily packed the last of their belongings into her car, casting one final look at the apartment that had been their first refuge. It was bittersweet, leaving behind the place where they had begun to heal, but as she glanced at Rex, sitting calmly in the back seat, she knew they were heading towards something better. The drive to the cabin felt like shedding an old skin. The farther they got from the city, the more Emily felt the tension in her shoulders ease. She glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, watching Rex as he stared out the window, his ears swiveling at the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside. When they finally arrived, the air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Rex hesitated as she opened the car door, his paws touching the gravel driveway cautiously. Emily crouched beside him, giving his leash a gentle tug. "This is home now," she said softly. Slowly, Rex stepped forward, his nose working overtime to catalog the myriad of new scents. He sniffed the porch steps, the door frame, the edges of the yard, his tail low but no longer tucked. Emily let him take his time, standing back to let him explore at his own pace. Over the weeks that followed, the change in Rex was nothing short of miraculous. At first, he remained cautious, sticking close to Emily as they explored the property. She made it a point to take him on daily walks through the woods, letting him set the pace. The trails were quiet, their only company the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. Rex seemed to relax more with each outing, his posture less rigid, his steps lighter. One afternoon, as they walked near a stream, Rex did something Emily hadn't seen before. He bounded ahead of her, his movements unrestrained and joyous. He paused at the water's edge, looking back at her with what could only be described as a doggy grin, his tail wagging in wide arcs. Emily laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. It was the first time she had seen him truly let go, and the sight brought tears to her eyes. Their life in the countryside settled into a rhythm that felt almost magical. Emily found work as a freelance writer, a job that allowed her to stay home and spend more time with Rex. She started a blog chronicling their journey, sharing stories of Rex's transformation and the challenges they had overcome together. To her surprise, the blog gained a small but dedicated following, with readers reaching out to share their own experiences with rescue animals. The community she built became a source of encouragement, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her mission to give Rex a better life. The locals in the nearby town also welcomed them warmly. A farmer down the road gave Emily fresh eggs every week, and the owner of the small general store always slipped Rex a treat when they stopped by. Rex, once so wary of strangers, began to trust these new faces, his tail wagging tentatively when someone approached. Emily marveled at his progress, her heart swelling with pride every time he greeted the world with a little more confidence. The true test of Rex's growth came one crisp autumn morning. Emily had joined a group of neighbors for a hike through the woods, Rex trotting happily beside her. The trail led to a small clearing where the group paused to rest. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing through the air. Suddenly, a sharp cry cut through the calm. Emily turned to see a young boy, no older than 6, standing near the edge of a steep embankment. His foot slipped on the loose soil, and before anyone could react, he tumbled down the slope toward the rushing stream below. Without hesitation, Rex bolted toward the edge, his body a blur of motion. Emily's breath caught as she watched him navigate the treacherous terrain with astonishing agility. He reached the boy just as the child's hand dipped into the cold water, grabbing hold of the back of his jacket and pulling him to safety. The boy clung to Rex, sobbing, as the dog stood protectively over him, his tail wagging reassuringly. By the time Emily and the others reached them, the boy was safe, his tears replaced with wide-eyed awe. "Your dog saved me," he whispered, looking up at Emily. She knelt beside Rex, wrapping her arms around him as pride and gratitude overwhelmed her. "He's a hero," she said softly, kissing the top of his head. News of Rex's bravery spread quickly through the town, solidifying his place in the community. The local paper ran a small story about the rescue, and Emily received dozens of messages from readers of her blog, praising Rex and expressing admiration for their journey. Despite the attention, life at the cabin remained blissfully simple. Rex seemed to understand that he was finally safe, his wariness replaced with a quiet confidence that made Emily's heart swell. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily rested her hand on Rex's head, her fingers brushing the soft fur between his ears. "We made it, didn't we?" she murmured. Rex leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed in contentment. The final piece of their puzzle came in the form of a letter. It arrived unexpectedly one morning, addressed to Emily but with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting neat and deliberate. It read, "Thank you for saving him. He deserved better and I couldn't give it to him. You did what I couldn't. Please take care of him." Emily stared at the letter for a long time, her mind racing. She couldn't be certain who had sent it, but she had a feeling it came from someone connected to Rex's past. Whoever they were, they had chosen to let him go, and for that she was grateful. She tucked the letter into her journal, a quiet reminder of how far they had come. As the seasons changed, Emily and Rex continued to build a life rooted in love and trust. The scars of the past, though not entirely forgotten, had become part of their story, a testament to their resilience. On quiet nights, when the stars stretched endlessly above the cabin, Emily would sit beside Rex, her heart full of gratitude for the second chance they had given each other. He was no longer the broken dog from the shelter, and she was no longer the woman afraid to take a risk. Together, They had found something neither of them had dared to hope for: peace and a place to call home. This story reminds us of the profound impact love, patience, and resilience can have on even the most broken souls. It's a testament to the healing power of second chances, not just for those we save, but for ourselves as well. Through Rex and Emily's journey, we see how trust is built one small step at a time and how bonds forged in adversity can transform fear into courage and isolation into belonging. Their story teaches us that no matter how dark the past may seem, with compassion and determination, brighter days are always possible. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If the story inspired you, please consider the power of second chances in your own life. Whether it's extending kindness to an animal in need or taking a leap of faith to heal and grow. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, filled with hope, courage, and the beauty of connection, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share stories that touch the heart and inspire change. Together, let's keep spreading love, one story at a time. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.